Okay, so in this last section of the chapter, we have to take the ideas of the Enlightenment, we have to try to plug them into the political landscape of Europe at the time. Basically, can the absolute rulers of Europe in the 18th century actually do anything with the ideas of the Enlightenment, or are they really just ideas that are incongruent, incompatible with absolute monarchy? So let's look at the context around this time period. Most of the enlightened philosophers, they actually did not advocate for democracy. We often think, oh, Rousseau and Locke, they advocate for total democracy and the general will, and that's true, but for the most part, some of our other favorite enlightened philosophers, like Voltaire and Montesquieu, they actually argue that monarchy is still the best type of government. We just have to change the way we go about ruling people. Voltaire believed in a tolerant absolute monarch, and Montesquieu believed in constitutional monarchy, just like we see in England. So even though we have some calls for democracy, most Enlightenment ideals talk about how the reforms and the changes to society should be handed down from despots, and they shouldn't be bottom up from the people. So they're inspired and they're influenced by their civil administrators who study the Enlightenment. That is, the leaders, the monarchs, are inspired and influenced by these bourgeoisie, but more importantly, the nobility and the rulers of the different towns and cities and outward parts of the government and different branches like the finance minister and the war minister. They're reading the Enlightenment, they're studying the Enlightenment, and they are kind of transferring that. But that's really the only quote-unquote bottom-up phenomena you see here. For the most part, it's the enlightened despots who take the ideas and try to institute them top-down. So our first stop here is Frederick II of Prussia. He's the son of Frederick William I, who we know is this strong Prussian military leader. Frederick II, growing up, studies the humanities, but he's versed in military affairs, obviously due to his father. And as soon as he becomes leader, very shortly after he becomes leader, he goes right into the military stuff and wages war against Austria in the war called the War of Austrian Succession. Basically, Maria Theresa is the new ruler of Austria, and Frederick II of Prussia takes this as an opportunity to attack and violate something called the Pragmatic Sanction, which was this kind of understanding, this rule, that Maria Theresa would inherit all of the land of Austria. And he does this because he wants to invade and take over this German part of Austria called Silesia. Very rich in resources, lots of people living there. It's a good place to have for Prussia if they can take it. And he does. In 1742, he takes it from Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa gets her payback, almost, in 1756 by allying with France and Russia in the 7 Years' War, which we'll learn about a little bit later on the France and Great Britain side. But in this war, she allies with France and Russia to try to take back Silesia and punish Prussia. And for a while, Prussia is losing this war. But when Peter III ascends to the throne in Russia, he's actually a fan of Prussia. He calls off the attack on Prussia, and that's what saves Prussia from having to cough up Silesia. Anyways, aside from wars, let's get back to absolute Enlightenment. So this is Frederick II here on his horse. And let's talk about Frederick the Great. Frederick II is known as Frederick the Great because the reforms he brings to Prussia. He sets out to bring reforms in Prussia inspired by the Enlightenment. One of the things that's most important with Frederick the Great is this idea of cameralism, that people should be loyal to the monarchy, nothing new here, just like absolute monarchy. In return, it is the monarch's duty to improve the lives of the people. See, up until this point, the monarch never was really seen as owing anything to the people. But this cameralism, this idea that the monarch's job is to boost the state and keep the people, going and improving the lives of the people, that is kind of a new concept. That is this idea of reason and progress from the Enlightenment being applied to ruling as an absolute monarch. So what did he do that was enlightened? He did boost education. He did create impartial judiciaries. He did promote some religious tolerance. But what did he not do? He didn't go all the way. He didn't end serfdom. This is a huge institution and it has huge implications on his nobility. He didn't do it. And he does limit special privileges. He did not limit the special privileges of the nobility. So the nobility is still privileged. They're still special just by being nobility, because the fact is the nobility is powerful and nobility helps keep him powerful, so he can't turn his back completely on them, even if the Enlightenment says that people should be a little bit more equal. But does it? We'll talk about that later. Moving to Russia, we have to learn about Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was a German princess with Romanov ties, so she's married back into the Romanov family. Gross. and she marries Peter III of Russia. He is only Tsar of Russia for about 6 months, and then she has him killed, thanks to her lover and her lover's brothers, who are military officers. They have him killed, and she replaces him as the Empress of Russia. How beautiful. When she becomes the Empress of Russia, she is inspired by the Enlightenment, and she is also a state builder, just like Peter the Great was. So she pushes to continue the reforms of Peter the Great that we talked about in the last chapter. She also supports the Western Enlightenment. She is a big-time friend of Voltaire, and even though Voltaire kind of trashes her in letters, and they go back and forth and they spat, they're actually friends, and she's learning a lot of Enlightenment ideals through her conversations and her friendship with Voltaire. She also offers to fund the publication and the distribution of Diderot's encyclopedia across Europe when it is banned in France. So she definitely buys into the Enlightenment. She is friends with enlightened philosophers, and that's going to have an impact on her rule in Russia. She, like Peter the Great, is going to continue to force the modernization of the nobility, make them catch up with the doings of philosophy and the philosophers of Europe. She does allow some religious tolerance and some local rule, but again, she stops short of going all the way. She does not cross the goal line here with reforms. She does not reform serfdom. A big part of that is because the Pugachev uprising, where Pugachev gets these serfs to rise up, and it's violent, and it's bloody, and it's an annoyance. She eventually puts it down, but it basically shows her that not only can she not abolish serfdom, but she should probably even expand it to kind of send a message here. And she bolsters the power of the nobility over the serfs. So if you are a noble under Catherine the Great, your stock is up right now. You've never had it better. If you're a serf under Catherine the Great, your stock is down. It's probably the worst it's been in a long time. So she does reform. She does include ideals in the Enlightenment, but she doesn't necessarily create equality. And this is a theme we're going to see with all of these enlightened despots. So here's Catherine the Great later on in her life. She also liked to ride horses, and there's a famous portrait of her in military garb on a horse. Something else that's important about Catherine the Great's rule is that she was a big-time supporter of expanding the territory of Russia. She pushes into southwest Russia towards the Caucasus on the other side of the Ottoman Empire. But the big grab here under Catherine the Great is this partition of Poland. And the partition of Poland, basically what it is the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, that we've been talking about for every chapter so far, just disappears. It literally disappears. It is carved up 3 times, in 1772, 1793, and 1795. It's divided amongst Austria, Russia, and Prussia. And it literally ceases to exist as a country. So if we look at this map right here, everything within this border is what Poland, Lithuania was before the partition of Poland in 1772. And you'll see that over these 3 partitions, 72, 93, and 95, it gets chipped away at until it literally disappears. And Russia gets a big chunk, right? This first part right here is what they grab in 1793, but they get and then 1795 they finish the whole thing off. And you'll see that Austria gets their first grab, and then they take even more, and same deal with Prussia right here. And it actually connects East Prussia with the rest of Prussia, so that helps. This is called the Polish Corridor. It disappears for now. It'll come back way, way, way later in the 20th century. But the point here is that Poland just disappears. And Russia gets a huge grab of that, and that is part of this legacy of territorial expansion under Catherine the Great. And it's interesting to note that you read about the Jewish Enlightenment and how the Jews were not yet emancipated, even though we're talking about religious tolerance more in this time period. The Pale, the reason where the Jews were, the place where the Jews were constrained to in the Russian Empire exists right here in what was Poland. So let's talk about the Habsburgs real quick. Maria Theresa, as we know, was the leader of the Habsburgs in the middle of the 18th century. She has, I think, like 16 kids, by the way, when it's all said and done. So when you hear about kids of Maria Theresa from here out in history, it's because there's like 1,000 of them. But Maria Theresa sets out to strengthen Austrian bureaucracy after the War of Austrian Succession. She realizes she has to strengthen the government and strengthen the country, the empire, to make sure that they can't be embarrassed again like they were when Prussia takes Silesia. So how does she do that? She limits the power of the nobility. She creates a more centralized government. Her son, who was a co-regent with her for a while and then takes over in his own right, Joseph II, takes over in 1780, and a year later he frees the serfs in 1781. He was probably the most radical of the enlightened despots. He went further than anybody else. He actually does try to free the serfs, but of course this is violently rejected by his nobility, and even the serfs don't support it, because to get out of serfdom, they could pay cash to their landlords. And that sounds like a good idea at first, except they have no cash. So if you have no cash, you're basically a serf, and your life's no better. So you hate Joseph II just as much as you did before. When Joseph II dies, Leopold II, his brother, takes over, and Leopold II basically cancels all of Joseph's reforms to restore order and stability. So the enlightened despotism of Joseph II is very short-lived in Austria. Sure, he does a lot of things with music, and he still brings on a lot of the other enlightened reforms like religious tolerance and so on, but as far as serfs go, that's a short-lived experiment. So these are kind of the basics here. Here's Joseph II of the different areas: Prussia, Austria, Russia, the central and eastern despots during the Enlightenment. So summing it all up here, what do we have to take away from this section? Well, it turns out that the Enlightenment and absolutism were not entirely incongruent. We often think, oh, the Enlightenment's all about, individual freedoms, and thus people should rule themselves, and you can't have an absolute leader. And that's not really the case. Many of the philosophers believe that monarchy was actually the best form of government. So these enlightened despots used the philosophy of the time to try to modernize their countries and give some rights. Again, that idea of cameralism, that they have a duty to help the people of the country and build up the country. But at the end, they weren't able to free the serfs. And their inability to end serfdom shows that there was little clamoring for equality despite the Enlightenment ideals. There's actually a little bit of hypocrisy here, that we can talk about the rights of man and reason and progress, but that stops at a certain point, like when we get to the serfs, the people in the fields. So that's enlightened despotism, that's enlightened absolutism, whatever you want to call it, and that is also the end of chapter 17. Good luck on the test.